Thank you everyone for jumping in today for the first ever BowtieGOAT Q&A session with those of you who are truly the GOATs, the students who have succeeded in whatever capacity they have at DECA. Tonight, I'm really excited to introduce our first ever GOAT session. I want to lay out a little bit about what that's going to look like. I intend to keep this one short. This is really to do a little bit of troubleshooting and introduce everybody to the process, but also just to say thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for participating. And thank you for engaging with this community. So what we're going to do is I want to introduce our GOAT, Aarnav. I want to introduce who he is. He's going to share a couple of things about his DECA success journey, about his experiences, particularly this year at ICDC. And then after that, we're going to jump into some Q&A. Now, because I know there's a little bit of a lag, Aarnav tonight is going to talk about his success in business finance, his success both in the role play and in the cluster exams. If you want to drop questions into the YouTube chat at any point, please do that. Aarnav is going to share a couple of things with us. And as he does, we'll kind of keep an eye on the chat and how those things work out. Aarnav is a rising senior at Interlake High School in Washington State. Aarnav competed this past year in business finance and came in second in the world in his event, which is fantastic. Now, Aarnav reached out to me on Reddit and had asked him the different ways that he could share his experiences with the DECA community. Aarnav had spectacular scores at ICDC. He had a 92 on that finance exam. And I don't know if you've ever tried to take that finance exam. It's really hard. And then in the preliminary rounds, the business finance students have to take 2 role plays like all the other individual role plays. Aarnav got a normalized score of 102 on each of those preliminary role plays, which I got to tell you, is really difficult to do. Those normalized scores just mean they kind of statistically analyze those scores and then bump them up or down based on the hard or easiness of their judges. A 102 means Aarnav had one of the hardest judges, and he had even the best scores among that hardest judge. So Aarnav found himself walking into the finalist round and get to compete at that finalist role play. The finalist role play that Aarnav did, he got a 97 on, which is unheard of. So Aarnav, congratulations to all that you've done. Thanks for reaching out and connecting with me. But I would be remiss to say that DECA is all that he does, because it's definitely not. So Aarnav lives outside of the Seattle area. And in addition to all the DECA work that he does, in addition to, I'm sure, being a rock star in the classroom and getting great grades, he also has started a business called Growify Me, where he's actually building out websites and helping small businesses around the Seattle area grow their online presence. And he's helped them increase their revenue over $100,000 over the past year and a half. So Aarnav, thank you for joining us today. And I am really excited for you to be able to share your experiences with the DECA community about the different things that you've done. But congratulations to all the things you've accomplished in the past year.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'm excited to share what I've done too. So as Justin said, my name's Aarnav. I competed in the business finance series. So essentially, just a little bit about my background for DECA. I started DECA last year in my sophomore year. And I initially didn't make ICDC in my sophomore year, but I eventually got bumped up and I made ICDC. And that itself for me was a rewarding experience, because I just got to see how everything happened. And then this past year when I took place, I got first at area, first at state, and as Justin mentioned, second at ICDC. So I've had a rewarding experience both this year. And I think there's a significant shift in strategies and tactics that I really employed and allowed me to do this. So I'm really grateful, first of all, to Justin for allowing me to share these tactics and strategies, so a lot of you can hopefully see the same success that I have, and also to just do this first live stream with me in the first place. So on top of DECA, I also play soccer, and I also referee soccer. So that's just something I do outside of DECA and then other extracurriculars. But without further ado, let me just start to share some of the 3 main things that I do that really helped me with DECA and helped me get first, and second. So the first thing that really helped me, especially at DECA and placing at DECA, was my cluster exam. And I cannot stress I can't stress enough how important your cluster exam is. Now, the main reason I say the cluster exam is probably the most important thing is because it's the only thing that's purely quantitative. So what I mean by that is your judges can screw you over as much as they want, but at the end of the day, your cluster exam is the only thing that no one else but yourself can screw over. So what that means is that you're the only person who has control over your own cluster exam score. So since it's the one thing you control, I decided to put in a lot of effort to make sure my cluster exam score was as high as possible. Now, I did this by just one basic thing, and that was taking the exams over and over again. If you've taken enough cluster exams, you're going to start to see a pattern, and that pattern is that the questions keep on repeating. So what this means is that if you do enough cluster exams and you keep on doing them over and over again, then you can really succeed in them. So essentially, before area, I did around 10 cluster exams. Before state, I did around 10. And then before ICDC for around a month, I would wake up early and I'd take a cluster exam every day. And that really helped me succeed in general, because compared to adding on to the cluster exams I did last year when I was a sophomore, that just resulted in me doing a bunch of cluster exams and almost memorizing each part of the DECA curriculum for finance at that point. And that's how I was able to crack such a hard exam. And that showed up in my test scores. I got a 96 at area on my cluster exam. I got a 94 at state. And I got a 92 at ICDC. So that really helped me. And I used to find just doing those over and over again really helped. And another thing is just whenever you get a question wrong, what I strongly recommend you do is go ahead and look at the reasoning why you got it wrong. And not only is that reasoning going to help you shift the way you think on when you take your next cluster exam, but also going to help you shift the way you think about your role plays. Because a lot of the content that's present in both the role plays overlaps in the exams and vice versa. So understanding how to do well on your exam also parallels directly to your role play. And that's going to bring me to my second point on how to stand out, which is how to succeed in DECA and how to just win as much as you can. And that second point is to stand out. So when we think about standing out, the main reason why you want to stand out is you want to put yourself in the shoes of the judge. So a judge probably has around 10 to 20 role plays every day, right? But at the end of the day, there's only going to be a few winners. So your whole goal to that judge is to stand out that whole period of time, whether that be with the accuracy of your content, whether that be with the knowledge you have, whether that be with your delivery, whether that be with the structure. Your whole goal should be to stand out. So what that means is not only having a good understanding of everything that you are covering and making sure that you know what you're talking about, but it also means trying to go for that extra step to essentially establish a connection with your judge, which is my third point. So really, when you want to stand out, you want to make sure you have a connection with your judge, because that's going to leave a memorable impact on your judge. Think about it like this, especially at ICDC when you're in the preliminary rounds, you're competing with 19 other competitors, only 2 of you progressed, right? So what's going to matter at the end of the day? Is it going to be the content that you progress, or is it going to be what your judge leaves with you, right? Because your judge has probably heard the same thing 10 to 12 times. So the main way you want to stand out is by leaving an impression. And the best way to leave an impression is 2 things: strong introduction and a strong closing. Because the main thing that someone remembers whenever they meet someone, this doesn't really necessarily relate to role plays, is the first time you meet someone, and then when you the last time you meet someone. Those are the 2 things that stand out to a person. This is just related to psychology. So basically, the main thing you want to take away this and put this into your role play is you want to have a very strong introduction and you want to have a very strong closing. And the main benefit of this is going to just stand out a lot more compared to something standing out in the middle. So what that means is if you have a really strong introduction and you have a really strong closing, and the middle of your role play is okay, it's like average, you're still going to have a good impact on your judge, because your judge is going to remember those key moments. And another recommendation that I have is at ICDC, there's like a lot of logistics going around. There's a lot of downtime even between meeting your judge and actually delivering the role play. So another way that I try to establish a connection is just by engaging some small talk with your judge, right? This can be before your presentation, after your presentation, or even during your presentation. You want to make it like a role play, right? And when although you're supposed to have like a one-word role play according to the DECA rules, I'd strongly recommend asking your judge questions. You want to make them engaged and keep them engaged throughout the whole process. I just think the best way to do so is by forming a connection and just by engaging in normal small talk, right? Cracking jokes here and there, asking them where they're from. This kind of stuff just goes a long way. And these small details these small details are going to help you stand out a lot more compared to just doing your content well and doing the delivery, which, I mean, at this point, everyone who's made it to ICDC has done too. So those are just my main 3 tips. Going back to them, cluster exam, just performing well. Ideally, you want to be scoring above a 90 on your cluster exam. I've had others, past students from my chapter who got class who've gotten high 80s. So ideally, high 80s to low 90s are like the minimum bar you want, especially when you're aiming for glass or higher. And then again, standing out, making sure your judge has a memorable impact on you. And I think the best way to do that is just by forming a connection. So those are my main 3 points.
If you have questions for Aarnav, I wanted him to start out with some of the things that he has seen that, really stand out about his progress. There are 1 or 2 questions already in the chat. Please drop questions into the chat. Aarnav is also going to try to field some of these questions as we go. So I want to say a little bit here before we get to those questions, but I can't stress enough how important that cluster exam is. And Aarnav started with that. If, the only thing that you can truly control at the DECA competition is that cluster exam, because everything else is subjective. How your judge hears you. And Aarnav gave you some great tips about what that looks like. And there are some questions in the chat about how to kind of make yourself stand out. But the cluster exam is key. If you folks don't ask about the cluster exam, I certainly will. Aarnav and I are going to try to, at this point, manage back and forth some of the questions that are in the chat. So as you do, I see Go for Glass there, I see Sarah there, I see Lena there, Leanna, I'm sorry. And as you do, please put the things in there. Aarnav, I'm going to allow you to maybe pick some of the things that you see are interesting, that you think are in your wheelhouse. And then as you're answering some of the things in the chat, I'm also going to try to reframe some of those questions that kind of group in around what you've already said. So yeah. Aarnav, go ahead.
So one of the first questions I got is, can you give me an example of how you might stand out? So this is a strategy I've kind of been milking throughout my whole process of DECA, and that's using acronyms. So what I mean by using an acronym is essentially, let's give an example of one of my most favorite performance indicators, which is explain the factors that affect a business's profit. When we talk about a performance indicator like that, what most people are going to do, they're just going to have a very basic explanation of it. But what I really recommend going ahead and doing is creating an acronym. Now, why would you want to create an acronym? An acronym stands out. I can guarantee you 19 of the other competitors, out of 19 of the other competitors, probably only a few others are going to be making acronyms. And then the second tip is, when you make that acronym, try to make it as creative as possible. So going back to my example of a performance indicator, identify factors that affect the business's profit. One of my favorite acronyms here is PEST, which stands for political, economic, social, and technological. This is obviously based off Steeple if you know a little bit more about business. But a good example of what you can do with this acronym is you can kind of make jokes with the judge, right? Just how like a pest eats out of a farmer's crop. These factors can kind of eat at our business's profit. So it's important to mitigate them. So I don't actually memorize these acronyms. I kind of think of them on the spot. And that's where I think practice really helps you do so. Just practicing over and over again on how to do these acronyms. You don't necessarily need to practice doing a role play for this. What I do is I had a whole list of every single performance indicator. And for each one, whenever I have any free time, whether that be in between classes or anything, I just note down and think of an acronym on the spot. And that just made that habit so much easier to do when I actually had to do the prep for the role play at ICDC. So what I recommend is just get a list of all of your performance indicators, write an acronym on the spot, pressure yourself and try to think of an acronym there that's creative. It doesn't necessarily have to be that creative like PEST, like something that's a lot more basic works too, and then use business terminology in those acronyms to really help you stand out. And that not only adds to your creativity points, but it also just shows that you have things thought out and you know what you're talking about. So that's one of the first questions, and that's how I stand out for Sarah. Another question I see is, how did I choose to prepare for the exam? So I think I kind of talked about this earlier, but I just did as many practice exams as possible. And I think that's just the best thing that anyone could do. So again, I've been in DECA for 2 years, so being in sophomore year really helped me just get more reps in. It's kind of like when you do a sport. If any of you guys have played a sport, when you're trying to learn something new in the sport, the best way to get better at it is to just do more reps. And it's the same thing when you take practice tests for DECA. So what I recommend is just do as many practice exams as you can. Try to find as many online. I think I found like 15 to 20 online. So just go ahead, try to use ChatGPT, just try to use Google, find as many as you can, create a list, and just go top to bottom, do as many as you can. And then when you're done with the ones at the bottom, restart, right? Because at that time, you've done so many practice exams, you're not going to memorize the questions, but your whole goal is to memorize the questions. So that's what I recommend and go ahead and do. So leading up to ICDC, I actually had I'm an IB student. I'm actually doing IB a year early. So what that means is I had all my exams. I had six exams at the same time basically as DECA. So what I do is, because I couldn't study in the afternoon as much for cluster exams, I just wake up an hour early and I do a cluster exam every morning, and that just really helped me get those reps in. So I'd recommend if you can do that extra step by just waking up an hour early. Once you get the habit going, it's a lot more easier than you think it is.
You actually said two things I would like to connect. And the first is about those cluster exams, because Rubik's in the chat just asked, what have you done? What do you do when you've done all the tests, you've got nothing left? And you sort of said, like, you kind of go back to them. But let's just kind of take this past year. How many different questions do you think you took over the past year? If you had to kind of rough ballpark, how many tests do you take? If each test has got 100 questions on it, how many times have you gone through those?
So first, to answer Rubik's question, I just did the tests again. But the thing that I was finding, so first, I think I probably did this whole year maybe around 30 to 40 tests. I don't know the exact number because I probably lost count, but it's definitely more than 30. It's probably more than 42. But then again, times 100, so maybe 4,000 questions. And what would actually happen is I wake up in the morning and I do these tests, but I would just complete them in 25 minutes. But so I was able to get my reps in a lot more quickly, because at that point I've memorized like 90% of the questions. So I'd always be scoring above a 90 based off that memorization. During the actual exams, I would spend every single minute. So at area, state, and ICDC, I was always the last person to submit, and I was just using that every minute to think in my head for questions that I found difficult. So I think I did around maybe 4,000, 5,000 questions. I know some people have suggested marking down the questions that you haven't got right and reusing those. But I think the problem with that is, especially when you do so many questions, you really just want to be repeating all the questions, because I'd find myself for questions that I've got right in the past, I'd still be getting them wrong. So I just recommend repeating all the questions, because it's just that much more ingrained in your mind, and it will help you that much more in the role plays.
Aarnav, you had said that you like coming up with acronyms, and you also said like you like to try to find a way to crack a joke with a judge, get them to smile a little bit. As an adult, as a teacher, if I sat all day and listened to teenagers come and present to me all day, I got to tell you, it gets really, really long. So I'm glad that you try to break that ice a little bit. There was a question asked by Assume that had just asked, like, what does creativity look like? You have a really, I'm sorry to say this, in business finance, you have a really uncreative event. What do you do to kind of build in some creativity? Is the acronym the only thing that you do? Can you give some more specific examples of how you might kind of lighten the mood a little bit with a judge? And I know it's kind of specific to the role play, but is there anything more you can say about that?
Yeah. So again, business finance is probably one of the most, I feel like for people who don't like finance, probably one of the most boring and uncreative events that there is. So I think creativity doesn't necessarily have to be with acronyms. It can also be with solutions. So just having that business experience. So I'm just interested in finance in general. That's why I chose my event in the first place. So just having that exposure with stocks, and just I would watch CNBC videos for fun. So that just helped me understand and just helped me just grasp other business solutions to my specific event. And also, I think creativity also tends to be with the way you structure everything, right? If you structure everything in a good, solid way, then it's going to allow your solutions to flourish a lot more. And that's just going to emphasize creativity a lot more. So I also think for boring clusters, I don't think the judges expect that much creativity. So I think acronyms are a good way to start. I think also having unique responses to your questions are very important, because again, the last thing that a judge remembers is your closing and your answers to those questions. So that's really going to help you a lot more when you have creative answers to those questions, and just being more exposed to the real business world and integrating that is also going to be very creative. So what I mean is, tariffs were a really big thing when I was going into ICDC. So I was preparing a lot about tariffs, but to my surprise, none of my role plays said anything about tariffs. The first role play, the second role play, the finals role play, none of them had anything about tariffs. But you still want to make sure that you just want to make sure you're a judge and tell them, like, kind of discreetly, that you know what you're talking about, you know what's going on in the real business world. So I'd still bring in discussion like tariffs, and apply it to my actual role play. And I think that also has something to do with creativity, right? Applying solutions that have some effect on the real world. So again, AI is probably going to be something really big that you guys can look into. Tariffs are also ramping up right now. So we don't know actually what stuff is gonna look like. Maybe in December, January when DECA starts again. But just staying up to date on these trends and integrating that is also a really good way to have creative responses.
So I always say to my students that you only ever really get to present to the same judge once ever. So if you have an acronym or a go-to kind of strategy to take through a role play, you can use that strategy over and over and over again. I was mentoring a student getting ready for ICDC this year, and this student had a particular quote that they like to use in their role play as an example of just bringing out outside information. And it feels weird to say this, but you truly can have the same quote that you use all the time because the judge is always going to be different. But to Aarnav's point, the ICDC competitors, especially once you get to that finalist round, everybody's going to know their PIs. So you have to think about a way to be creative. So Aarnav, I have a lot of students who really love that acronym approach. I have other students who just know going in, they have one or two or three go-to strategies for tackling a role play, and they just kind of look at that role play and decide on the spot which one of those three strategies they're going to use. But folks, it's really important to know, like, your judge is not going to see you again. So you can use the same strategy for all three judges at ICDC, and you can crush it with the same thing. So once you get something that you're comfortable with, go ahead and keep doing that.
Yeah, and I just want to
go ahead. Yes.
add something quickly to that. Is also, I forgot, your visuals are also very important. So even though I'm in finance, I try to make a visual for every single PI, and I think that just helps, right? So trying to make visuals for every single PI you have, that's also pretty important. And be creative with the way you draw them. So like, even if I have an acronym, I'll write the acronym on my paper just to improve that presentation quality.
So Aarnav, can you give another example of what a visual might look like? So you said an acronym, but what else might you do with a PI for a visual?
Yeah, so if I can't think of a PI on the spot, what I usually have is I'll just have 5 solid points to think about, and that will really help me guide my discussion. So what I mean by that is I can't think of a PI on the spot, but let's just go back to identify factors affecting a business profit. If I didn't have an acronym there, I would just write down 5 important business terminology terms that really emphasize and answer that PI, and I draw like a small visual there. So if you like go to a website, for example, we usually have like a icon or something like that that's usually next to a point, right? So usually I have like a $sign, which is pretty basic. If it would be related to people, I draw like a person, stuff like that, and that would just guide my discussion. And I could just I'd have the paper like this, and then I could just point to the paper, and I could really show, right? Look at this. I'm talking about this, and this is a really nice visual. So the person can really just, while they're taking notes, they can just directly take notes from that. And then I'm just rambling on at that point, but they can really understand what I'm saying because I have that visual to guide me. So, yeah, so I see a quick question that I can answer, which is, have you ever seen duplicate questions on the exam? And I'll tell you this, I've never seen an exam that does not have a duplicate question. So, it's pretty much on every single exam. And then I see another question which says, what makes a top 3 roleplay much different from a finalist roleplay or a top 10 roleplay? So I think the main thing is just standing out, like I mentioned earlier. So I mentioned how to stand out. But I think at that point, everyone knows your PIs, everyone knows what you're talking about. So again, having that connection with the judge is very important. And that relates to another one of the other questions that I see, which is, when I first meet with a judge, should I still be in character? Now, when we're talking about in character, there's 2 important things to note, right? So the first thing that's important to note is, number 1, what the judge thinks, right? So sometimes you can directly see on the judge's face whether they're in character or not, but you can also understand that a lot of these judges have the expectations that you're a high school student coming in acting as someone else. So they know, they kind of have this thing subconsciously in the back of their mind that you're not the actual person. So I think from that perspective, if you just have a little bit of small talk, ask them how they're doing, stuff like that, doesn't really have that much of an effect as you might think. I think it helps you more than it hurts you. But I also think there's a right way to do it, which is to my second point. So what I mean is, once you start getting into character, you want to stay in character throughout the whole time, right? So that doesn't mean so what that really means is it's okay to have small talk in the beginning. It's okay to ask them just how they're doing, where they're from, stuff like that. But once you actually start presenting, it doesn't make sense to go back to that, because at that point in time, you've already built yourself up. So I think that kind of answers the question. When I first meet with a judge, should I still be in character? Not necessarily. It depends on the judge. But still, I think it's really important that once you go and actually get into character, you sustain that momentum, because that momentum is really what's going to help you ultimately answer your questions really well at the end.
I'm sure that we've missed some questions. So folks, if you put a question in here and it wasn't quite answered the way you want, go ahead and throw it back in the chat, because this is my first time doing this and it is a little overwhelming. I do want to shout out, if you are hyper online and you do Discord stuff, Go Over Glass is a great Discord channel to be part of. They are also the manager of the right word, of the DECA subreddit, which I lurk on obsessively. So there's a lot of resources out there, but I am happy to be able to bring this sort of live stream to you to help you interact with GOAT specifically. Arnav, do you see any other questions here that you want to address?
So I think Rubik's asked us twice. How do you structure responsive questions? That's something I initially struggled with, so I think it's important to address that. So I think usually when you have a response to a question, you're going to have multiple things to talk about to that question. And I think the main thing is you want to first, when you get that question, you want to take a minute and think. If you don't understand the question completely, just ask the judge to repeat it. That's going to give you some time to think. So the first thing I'd do is, if I didn't understand it, I'd ask the question again. The second thing is I'll just outline 3 points. So let's say they talk about like the question is something related to like for example, what are some recommendations that you have in order to bring more customers in? This is a very vague question, but I think you can answer this by just saying, like, you can start out by answering by saying something like, I have 3 ways I'm going to do this, and then you want to list those ways. And then once you list those ways, not only have you created a nice structure and makes it seem like to the judge that you know what you're talking about, but the second thing you've allowed yourself to do is you've allowed yourself to have more time to think about actual things. So then I'd list my 3 ways, and then I'd go back by saying, I'd go back and say, do you have any more questions or stuff like that? And I'd wrap those specific 3 things that I outlined and relate them back to the role play. I think relating them back to the role play and emphasizing that you probably thought of this ahead of time, if you have, is really beneficial. So I think those are the main few things that would really help. It's just structuring out your question, just like how you do for a role play, and making sure that gets revisited back to your role play. If that kind of makes sense for Rubik's.
I saw a YouTube short recently of Steve Jobs answering a very difficult question from an MIT student. He took 19 seconds of a pause. Guys, when you get asked a judge's question, don't feel like you have to say something right away. The pause to you might feel monumental, but it is far better to pause and get your thoughts about you before you just start speaking and filling the void with nothingness. So if you pause for even 20 seconds before you say anything, that's not nearly as long as you think. So as Arnav just said, even if the best you could do is restate the question and kind of tick through, like, here are 3 things, just make sure you know how you want to start saying it before you open your mouth. And that goes a long way.
Before going into ICDC, I would stutter a lot. I would use a lot of filler words like. Like was probably one of the biggest filler words I'd use. So then I would just do this thing is whenever I feel like I have to use a filler word, I just take a break and I just pause. And those 1-2 second pauses not only allow your tone to feel a lot more natural, but it also just helps you remove those filler words that aren't necessarily beneficial. But filler words aren't necessarily always bad. Adding a few in between just makes it seem more natural. What I mean by that is, like, if you see me here saying sometimes, that's natural human talk. Like, anyone in a conversation uses It's not necessarily a bad thing to use but if you have a habit of using a lot of filler words, and especially one filler word, I recommend just stop using that filler word altogether by just taking a break.
If you've got any last minute questions, I'd love you to throw them into the chat.
Yeah, so I see another question that I'm going to address, which is from Awesome, where he says, I use a strategy where I mention a PI word for word so the judge knows which PI I'm addressing. Is that a good strategy? And I'd say 100% yes, that is a good strategy. Because a lot of the judges, even at ICDC, I found some of them aren't necessarily as experienced as others. So you just want to make sure that you address each PI completely, and the judge knows what PI you're talking about. So not only would I take that first step to mention that PI word for word, but I'd also go ahead and I'd go in the order of PIs if that's possible. I feel like mixing up one or two is fine, but usually start with the PI that comes up first because that's the first thing the judge is going to see. So if you can start with the first PI, that's obviously great. Sometimes it doesn't make sense order-wise, but we're mentioning the PI word for word is really great, but you want to make it seem as natural as you can. So again, in the introduction, I always mention which PIs I'm going to cover, which is usually all of them. Unless they're like organized information, for example, I'll skip that one. But when I'm just addressing each PI, I would specifically mention the word, the language that's used for each PI. It doesn't need to be exactly word for word. If I'm being honest, for me to write, when I write down the PIs and take that sheet of paper to the actual presentation and the role play, I use shorthand to write them, so I don't know the actual word for word terminology for that specific performance indicator, but just having the general idea so the judge really understands what you're talking about is important. So it doesn't need to be word for word. I misspoke there earlier, but it just needs to have a general, the judge just needs to know what you're talking about. And if word for word is the best way for you to do that to the judge, then do it. If you can summarize it, even better, right? Whatever works for you so that the judge knows what you're talking about.
Aarnav, as a teacher who has to evaluate a lot of students who come into the classroom, if the kids aren't addressing the stuff that's specifically on the rubric, it's very, very hard. And even though they might be the most engaging and thoughtful individuals, unless they're doing what's on that rubric, which in DECA is those PIs, it's really hard to give them a great score. So yes, 100% try to be as close as you can to what the PI actually was. And unless there's a reason to switch them up, go in order, because that's the way it is on the judge's rubric. Make it easy for that judge. Aarnav, before we say goodbye, I'd like to at least say thank you, because this has been incredible. I'm glad that, a couple dozen folks have been able to log on and share questions with you, and that this is an opportunity that they can hear from somebody who's truly cracked that DECA stage, because a lot of us don't have the opportunity to interact with somebody like that. So congratulations again to all the success you've had. Thank you for your time. Folks, if you have any questions for me, you can send them specifically to me at BowtieGOAT@gmail.com. But if there are any other last questions that you've got for Aarnav, please throw them into the chat. And if not, we're going to wrap it up here soon. But Aarnav, do you have any last minute tips, last minute things you want to see in the chat that you want to address?
No, but thank you so much for everyone who's joined. I hope I was able to help answer your guys' questions, and I hope my tips are going to be helpful for you guys when competition season does come around. I think the first step, which a lot of you guys have done, is thinking about DECA in the summer is really a really big first step. I didn't start preparing for DECA last year until probably November, and I was able to win class. So I think if you guys are starting this early, you definitely have an advantage time-wise. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining. I'm so happy to see so many of you join and answer so many of your questions. And yeah, go Sounders, as Awesome says. Awesome said.
So our next GOAT Q&A will happen in September. I will have a hard date for that within the next couple of weeks. Continue mastering all the work that you're doing. Please start thinking about those exams and those performance indicators. But Aarnav, thank you so much for your time today. Good luck to all of you on your DECA success journey. And guys, we get to go to Atlanta this year. I can't wait to see you and say hi to you in Atlanta. Aarnav, thank you so much for spending your time with us.